Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks here on my YouTube channel. My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to be showing you how I built this hardwood memory/gift box with brass hinges and a lock and key. Stay tuned. For those of you who are new to my channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button below and the little bell icon next to it so that you stay notified when I release new project videos. Alright, let's get started. The first step in this project is to take the piece of walnut that I chose to build the box out of and cut it into 4 separate pieces, each with 45-degree miters on each end. 2 of the pieces will be 16 inches long and then 2 of them will be 12 inches long. And that is the exterior length. This box is a prototype for another box that I'll be building after this box, box on box. And so I didn't worry about doing the continuous grain. There's lots of different techniques for doing continuous grain around a box, and when you do that you don't want to do the miters like I'm doing for this box, but like I said, this is a prototype, so I didn't worry about that. Once these 4 pieces had been cut, I went over to my table saw where I had installed my dado stack set, the blade set, to be a 1/2 inch wide, and I cut dados on the top and bottom of the inside of each of these pieces. And this groove will be where the lid and the base of the box will be able to slide in. Once those dados were cut, I returned to my miter saw, where I took a piece of red oak and I cut it into 4 separate pieces that will eventually be glued together 2 at a time, and these will make up the top and the bottom of the box. After they were cut down on the miter saw, I went over to my planer and I planed them down to the correct thickness so that they could fit into those dado grooves, those dado cuts. After test fitting one of the pieces of oak into one of the dado cuts, I pulled out my bark lamps and I glued up 2 of these at a time, like I said, to make up the base and the lid of the box. When you're doing a glue up like this, it's important to ensure that the 2 pieces of wood remain flat against the bark lamps as you tighten the bark lamps. They have a tendency to buckle. It's a good idea to wipe as much of the glue off before it dries. Once these had dried overnight, I removed them from the clamps and I took them over to the table saw where I squared up the sides and the ends. If you're enjoying this video, you should hit the subscribe button below. Also, head over to my channel and check out all of the other videos I have posted. I think you'll like them. Once the 2 boards had been squared up on my table saw, I returned to my workbench and used some chisels and some sandpaper to clean up the 2 seams. Once I had cleaned the 2 seams up, I pulled out my orbital sander and sanded the entire box, or what would be the entire box, with 120 grit sandpaper. Now, it's best to do the sanding process before you glue the entire box up. It makes the whole sanding process a whole lot easier. Once everything had been sanded down, I pulled out my Titebond 2 and I began the gluing process. Now I gotta say, this gluing process is a little bit nerve-wracking, but it worked out in the end. It's important to spread the glue across each of those miters as well as in the dado cuts so that the joint between the walnut and the oak is strong. I used this nifty strap clamp that I picked up at Home Depot, which I was pretty impressed by, but I ended up having to use some bar clamps as well. Since this was the prototype, I wasn't too worried about the miters not being perfect, and I came back to the box after it had dried, and I used a wrench and a screwdriver to round over the edges of the miters. This is a really simple way of fixing miter joints that aren't perfect. And then I came back with some glue and sawdust and filled in some of the gaps. The idea of using the wrench and the screwdriver is to have a hard surface that you can rub against the miters and actually just rub the wood into the center of the miter. And it kind of serves as a way of bending the end of the miter into the wood as opposed to just sanding it off. This is a good technique, and one that I picked up off of YouTube. After the box was relatively cleaned up, I took it over to my router table where I had installed the quarter round bit with a bearing on the top, and I rounded over some of the outside edges of the box. Once this was complete, I returned to my table saw and I cut the box into two different pieces, the lid and the actual box. Once the box was cut in two, I could then access the inside of the box. I then used a chisel to clean up some of the glue. I then took some plastic wood and I wanted to see if I could darken the actual color of the plastic wood, so I used some stain, some walnut stain, and I mixed it into the plastic wood, and then I rubbed it into the miters where there were small gaps. Now, I should have sanded this off right after it had dried, but I didn't, and I ended up having to sand it later on in the project after I do the first coat of oil. Now, this isn't recommended, but it works. After that was complete, I went back over to my table saw and I used a spline jig that I made out of plywood. There's a link above for the video making the spline jig. Cut some splines, and then I cut some pieces of walnut on my small bandsaw, and I inserted these splines into the different corners of the box. Not only do wooden splines add some stability to the miter joints, they also add an elegant aesthetic feature to your woodworking projects. Once the splines were complete, it was then time to mark out the area where I would be placing these nifty brass hinges that I picked up off of Rockler. I'll put a link in the description below. I use my DeWalt palm router to actually router out the different areas where the hinges would be sitting, and I also use it to do the mortise where the arm of the hinge goes into the side of the box. But I'll give you a pre-warning that freehand routering these areas is a bit difficult, and I made some mistakes that I had to patch later on. There is a template, a quadrant hinge template guide that is sold on Rockler that makes this process a whole lot easier. I'll put a link in the description below. I also used a small chisel to help clean up the mortises where the arm of the hinge will go into the side of the box. I then attached the hinges to the box. After that, I went over to the other side of the box and marked out the center line where I could then place the lock that I also picked up off of Rockler, and marked out the area where I would need to router and make a mortise for the actual lock mechanism to sit down into. And then after that, I could use a drill to drill a hole on the face of the box where the keyhole would be. Like I said, freehand routering these sections is a bit difficult, so I came back with some glue and sawdust and patched up some of the holes. After that, I put the lid on top of the box and marked out the area on the lid where the lock mechanism would be sitting. It's very important to have these lined up, otherwise the lock won't work. I once again use my router to router out the section where the lid lock mechanism would be sitting. I also did a small mortise so that the actual lock had a space to go into the wood. I then went to the back side of the box and marked out the area where the hinges would be attaching to the lid. I did some patching and then went back over to the lid, marked out the areas where I would be routering out the section for the hinges, and got straight to routering. And I had to do another mortise for those arms because the arm actually goes into the lid as well as the side of the main box. Once I had finished routering and chiseling out the areas for the hinges, I used a small drill bit to pre-drill some holes for the screws that attach the hinges to the lid. I also pre-drilled some holes for the lock mechanism on the front side of the lid. After that, I attached the hinges and the lock mechanism. Then I used some 2x4s that I stacked on the back side of the box that would hold up the lid so that then I could attach the lid to the box. Once the hinges were attached to the box, it was the moment to test and make sure that the lid and the box lined up and that the lock worked. And gotta say, I was a bit nervous, but it worked. Yay. After that, I did a bit of sanding. Once the sanding was complete, I moved on to using a microfiber towel to rub off any excess dust, used a vacuum to vacuum it up, and then I moved on to what is usually my favorite part of any woodworking project, the oiling. Now, the reason I love this part of the project is because when you rub in that oil, it really brings out the grains of the wood and makes your project come alive. At this point, the project was just about complete. I came back and sanded it after the oil had dried, and I applied one more coat. But then after that, the project was done, and I gotta say, I was really stoked with how this box turned out, especially since it was just the prototype. The lock mechanism and the hinges both worked really well, and the wood itself looks so beautiful. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode of Second Son Woodworks and learned just a bit about how to build a box. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Like I always say, build something cool. Thanks, guys.